From the Personal Diary of Annabelle McGregor. The 7th of January, 1932. Garis came home today. He seemed paler than he used to, much more quiet. I wish there was something I could do. I wish I could bring him back to us. But he's gone. I have to accept that. We all have to. As it turns out, the diary of Annabelle McGregor, Garis Crey's adoptive mother, for those of you who don't remember, was used in the writing of a 1998 psychological thesis by Catherine Jacobs entitled From Garis to Hannah, a study as to the effects of child molestation. In this book, the author uses materials from various different child molestation trials to form an in-depth study on the resulting mental scars such experiences can procure in children. Annabelle's entries themselves aren't that relevant, often repeating the same thing over and over, but they do form a cohesive thread between two big events in Garis Crey's life: his release from the West Riding Mental Hospital and his journey back to America. According to Annabelle McGregor, 19-year-old Garis Crey left his parents a week after returning to them, going off to work in a shoe factory. After being fired for inability to follow proper safety instruction, he worked as an assistant ballet instructor in London. 6 weeks after this, he returned to his parents, where he learned that they had been harboring a secret from him. After Sheridan, his previous adoptive father, had died, Garis was left to inherit all of his belongings. This included the expansive novel Puppets and the script and score for Puppetmaster, the musical version of the same novel. From the Personal Diary of Annabelle McGregor. 18th of September, 1932. Garis called to tell us that he was leaving. We asked when he was coming home. He hung up after that. It's been 4 days, and I'm beginning to believe that I won't see him ever again. Not much is known about Garis Crey after that. The next existing record of him is in a financial statement in 1933 concerning an inquiry for a choreographer for the Puppetmaster's regime. It would appear that Garis was continuing his adoptive father's work. Why on earth Garis Crey would drop everything in his life to continue the work of his parental rapist is beyond all logical comprehension. One reason could be that he wanted to understand his father more. He was, after all, Sheridan's son. Perhaps he understood how much Puppetmaster had meant to him, and he had devoted himself to polishing up the production. In Catherine Jacobs' book, she details a great many examples of this. In the letter from Garis to the aforementioned choreographer, he writes, "I hope to enliven the production with a bit of playful mystery, such as the essence of the original novel format." I don't have the complete manuscript for Puppets, though Catherine Jacobs apparently does own a small snippet of about 200 pages. God only knows how she acquired it. She lists a total of 17 excerpts in her book, from what I've read. The prose of Puppets is very difficult to understand. One might assume that Sheridan hadn't ever stopped writing it, and had never revised. The story itself follows the main character, Marauder, as he goes off on an adventure to explore his own sexual agenda upon the request of a puppet that he meets in a dream. To get a feel for the odd, flowery nature of the writing, here's an excerpt. "The puppet was as black as night upon the cold winter eve of Lamastide. Light and airy, yet weak and bitterly sharp. Upon sensing the figure's wooden presence, he scattered himself about the room, unable to find a proper door or window to relieve his urge to escape the angry monstrosity. His eyes danced along the riverway of contempt, stealing glances of the form that beckoned for him to remain motionless. Defeated, he rested himself within his own terror, bending as he slipped into his remorse and fear. I have nothing to work on but the vague points provided by Miss Jacobs for this assumption, but I gather that Garis used his inheritance to fund the production of the Puppetmaster's regime. In the box 34 Creeley Right, I found a small folder full of production notes from Garis that I had glossed over in my previous search. Nothing of great importance stands out other than the pitch Creeley used to gain attention of several theater owners who were interested in housing the production. In this, Garis describes the show as upbeat, fraught with flowery production numbers, and a moral all ages can relate to. I feel like this is a good time to bring up my meeting with Miss Alice Corley James. I made sure to phone her grandchildren for permission to visit, for which I was declined 3 times. After I sent the cake, they understood my presence, and I was granted access. It was a 6-hour drive to the home of Alice Corley James. Her granddaughter was hospitable enough, well, as hospitable as someone can be when they obviously don't want you in their house. She took me to the living room and offered me some cake, which I declined. A few minutes later, I met Alice, who limped her way onto the couch with a plate of cake in her hand. I tried speaking with her, but she refused to talk to me until she had finished eating. I took an instant liking to the old bat, nutty as she was. Throughout the following Q&A, Alice made it very apparent that she had reviewed her facts, and they seemed rehearsed and tired coming from her lips. But I didn't think much of it. From the Testament of Alice Corley James, 1926 to present. How old were you when you saw the Puppetmaster's regime? 9? I had just turned 9 that Wednesday, and we were going to have a party the following Saturday. What do you remember about the production? I don't truly remember a lot about the show. I was young, I was hyperactive, and I was bored. Bored to tears by the entire thing. It was so very monotonous and so blandly staged. I recall watching the 3 kiddies dancing the exact same motion, twist, tap, for almost 4 minutes, all while the ensemble walked in crisp lines. It was so awkward. That little boy playing the main character, Maury something or other, was a bit quiet, if you asked me. He sort of mumble-spoke, squinting the entire show. Those vague, squinty eyes were bland, too. I fell asleep halfway through Act 1. And do you remember the end of Act 1? No. When I woke up, my parents were dragging me out of the theater. I spent the next 3 hours waiting by the street with my mother while my father searched for his brother. Our Uncle Devin was the assistant choreographer, you see. He died backstage. I think a lift collapsed. I don't know. It was only when I was 30 did they actually tell me what happened, though I remember that they never acted the same again. Did your uncle keep any documentation of his time working on the production? I wouldn't know. We weren't all that close to him, you see. If he did, where could I find those documents? Well, either they're still at the theater, or... My father... Oh, yes. My father probably had them. I remember the policeman delivering a box to us. Your best chance of finding it would be in the attic. We moved all of my father's old office documents into a red... Yes, it was red. A red chest. If it wasn't there, it was most likely thrown away. Mrs. James's granddaughter aided me in my search, and together we found the red chest, as well as Devin Corley's belongings. They had been shoved into a small storage crate within the chest, sloppily strewn in wrinkled chunks of paper. I offered Alice the opportunity to rifle through the crate, but she politely shooed me out of the house before asking for another piece of cake. At first, I couldn't make much sense of the contents within the box. There are a few bills, some production notes, a list of ensemble performers. However, one particular sheet of paper does catch my interest. The audition notes for the role of Marauder. For those of you who don't remember, this was the character whose actor was last seen begging the audience to help him on the night of the Puppetmaster's premiere. Not many names are found in this file, oddly enough. Just 14 boys and 6 girls. Underneath the various names are notes over the auditions. Notes that say, too cheeky, too quiet, too mumble-mouthed. But about 3/4 into the paper, the name Timmy Wright is circled 3 times, a small star etched beside it. He's the one, the note read boldly. I've done a bit of research on this performer as well. Timothy Cartwright was born in August 16th of 1923. His father, Vincent Cartwright, was a lighting designer for a theater on Broadway. His wife, Margie, was a costume designer, though little is known about the beginning of Timothy's career, but by the age of 9 he had taken the vaudeville world by storm as Timothy Cutie Pie Wright, or Cutie Wright for short. As far as I can gather, his only Broadway credit before the Puppetmaster's regime was in a semi-successful flop called Joyful Hooligans, in which he played a young British boy who falls off a ship and is taken in by a band of American teenage pickpockets. Devin Corley's diary details the arrival of Timmy to the theater. He says that Timmy was asked to be dropped off in the lobby without his parents. Garis Crey instructed the staff not to enter the lobby for an hour. At the end of this hour, Garis Crey himself came through the lobby doors and found Timmy still in his seat by the reception desk. He was quoted to have looked confused and scared, with a look in his eyes that likened to an old cat, weak and defenseless. Garis led him back to his office, where he waited for his parents to return to sign the paperwork. The next few entries of Dennis Corley's diary describe the hiring of the rest of the cast and crew. Shirley Taxam was signed on to play Shawhunt for 3 weeks. Died in an automobile accident and was replaced by Sally Wilkes. Henry Gregory, another vaudeville performer who had worked with Timmy at least twice before, was signed on to play Ottlebit. Other cast members, including Fernando Perrin as Mr. Obisker, and Grace Day as Madame Reperio. A casting for the Man in Black, as well as the puppet dressed in black, are not listed. Set design was done by Abraham Durate, and costumes were done by Julianne White. Lighting and direction was taken up by Garis Crey himself. For the first 2 weeks of production, Dennis Corley's description of Crey doesn't seem too interesting. A bit eccentric, a bit of a perfectionist, but he's also described as jolly and surreal, like the Santa impersonators that you see at the department stores. He was always cracking jokes, and for the most part, he had a good attitude. However, as innocent as his behavior seemed, even from the beginning, he has a strange obsession with Timothy Wright. Corley details an instance where Timothy was clearly getting the choreography wrong, and yet Garis berates the other children for messing him up. From Dennis Corley's perspective, he coddles the boy and barely even directs him. Now, as lighthearted as he was, Garis Crey was also a rather strict director. Devin Corley claims that each of the cast members was to arrive at 4 in the morning, 2 hours before crew arrived, simply for vocal exercises and warm-ups. One entry states, the ensemble was placed into 3 lines, and the children were lined up in front. Mr. Crey would spend 15 minutes going over the exact same tap routines each morning. He always had Timmy do it first. Then the others were to follow. Afterwards, everyone was to gather in a circle for vocal warm-ups. It would start by going through the ranges. Then Garis had us do that awful dance. They were to be 2 circles, one inside the other, and the cast would hold hands. Then both circles were to dance around in opposite directions. The outer circle began to chant first, crying out, "Simmental, Simmental," while the inner circle yelled out, "Freyla, Freyla." Both chants were ensemble vocals that had been cut from the production, but Mr. Creeley saw fit to include them every morning, saying that they were perfect vocal warm-ups. Garis's impatience continues throughout the rehearsal. He grows violent, and more cast members report to Darren that Sally Wilkes exhibited bruises on her upper arm. The script was modified weekly, putting the company in great stress. Timmy Wright was the one who took most of the damage, as most of the changes gave his character more lines, placing him under a lot of pressure. He was often asked to visit Creeley's office for private readings, where he'd stay for hours. Tragedy enters the life of Timothy Cartwright on August 13, 1933, when he and his family had been the victims of an automobile accident which killed his father and severely injured both his mother and he. Tevin writes that for a month and a half, Garis visited Timothy daily and eventually stopped coming to rehearsal altogether. The principal choreographer, Mandis Thorman, took up the role of director during that time. It was also during that time that they sought out the employment of 14-year-old Rory Atkins to be the understudy for Timmy. Devon writes that it was at the conspiring of Thorman and the producers that Rory would eventually replace Timmy. "This cute Wright," writes one producer, "is completely inept in the art of performance. His delivery is too big, his eyes are too big, his presence is too big, and for all that bigness, he has a shockingly little amount of talent and discipline. Mr. Creeley spoils the boy and hardly gives a scrap of motivational honesty in the direction of anyone else. In short, Timothy Cartwright must go." While Garis Crey was gone, the production staff also persisted in cutting certain things from the show. This included a number that occurred midway through Act 2. A gibberish number sang by an army of puppets that they say slowed down the production. Creeley was quite unhappy with this, giving them several angry phone calls about the matter, and they eventually gave him an ultimatum: cut the number completely or put it somewhere else. Garis placed it at the end of Act 1. Devon notes that Garis would tell the children to practice this number on their own time, and when they did run through it during rehearsals, it was in segments, never in its entirety. The number itself contained one group of lyrics that was repeated over and over again. Garis made it painfully clear that the company has to sing these stanzas exactly 100 times before they could take a break during the intermissions, even if the curtains had closed before they were finished. Devon's journal ends with a relief from notes throughout. Instead, he explains an event that he himself was present for. I think it's best to probably just read the section itself. "Nobody was ever allowed in Mr. Creeley's office but Mr. Creeley and Timmy. I assumed Mr. Creeley would want to meet Rory, but never asked for an audition with him. However, Mandis had instructed me to deliver 3 resignation letters to Mr. Creeley's desk, and I went to my task. When I came in, the room was all mussed and hot, like there wasn't even air conditioning in there. The windows were down, but my vision adapted fairly quickly. I saw that on the floor was a worn mattress with plates and cups all around. I blinked in surprise. Rushing over to the bedding, I saw that it had definitely been in use for quite a while. I wondered in astonishment if Mr. Creeley had been living in the theater. And when I considered the idea, I did recall that he'd put all of his money into this show, and we never heard him ask us to send papers to his house. only his office. Along the far end of the room were a few piles of shirts and trousers. It was still very dark, so I didn't focus on them too much. I went to set the papers down on the desk when, against my better judgment, I had the urge to snoop around a bit. I looked over the top of the desk. Nothing but pens and scrambled folders. Then went right to the corner drawer. What was inside the drawer frightens me more now than it did when I saw them. Within the drawer was a gun. A bit eccentric, maybe, but I thought nothing of it. As well as a worn, hand-painted mask. Red in color, it was put into a shape of a doll's face. A puppet's. Beside the mask was a small journal. I opened it and found the pages to be yellowed with age. The pages themselves concealed mad writings that were barely legible, but I could tell by the drawing that it was some sort of worshipper's guide. There were these charcoal sketches of a puppet, a giant puppet, that controlled the world on strings protruding from its fingernails. Other pictures showed the puppet walking amongst common men who couldn't see it. There was a man stroking the bodies of his wife and children. A young girl being brought for the night by an older gentleman. Two twins being held down on their bed by some invisible force. All pictures in which the puppet stood by, grinning. I placed the journal back into the drawer, but then I noticed the mask. The mask had the same face that the puppet had. An insane grin, wide eyes, puffy cheeks. It was only when I held it closer to my face did I notice it also shared the features of Timmy. The same mouth, the same nose, the same eyes. I shoved the mask back into the drawer and shut it quickly. My curiosity morphed into sickness. I backed away from the desk and hit the wall. Turning to my right, I felt my right foot come into contact with the pile of clothes that I saw earlier. My eyes had completely adjusted to the dark by now, and I could see that not all of the shirts and trousers were in Mr. Creeley's size. At least 4 of them were smaller. The clothes a young boy would wear. I grabbed the papers off the desk and ran out. I delivered them to Mr. Creeley's hand that afternoon. And after that, there are 7 pages blank in the journal of Devon Corley. There are no more entries. At the bottom of this crate, however, was a newspaper dated October 3rd, 1935. The headline reads, "Flower Shop Vandal Strikes Again." And on the 3rd page is a small section dedicated to the disaster that occurred at the August Wilson Theater on October 1st. Oddly enough, the article doesn't mention the Puppetmaster's regime by name more than once, but it focuses on the aftermath. In an interview, the police officer Jeremy Winthrop, "We ain't got no idea what could have happened. We got a call from a diner down the street, talking about some riot going down at the August Wilson. We came to find a bunch of theater-goers crying and begging for help. They just kept saying, 'They're dead, they're dead, they're really dead.' We went inside, but we didn't find nothing." You see, 76 attendants of the 1935 showing went missing. 98 if you count the theater company, whose bodies were never recovered from the stage, though many testified to have seen them die. Others claimed to have seen people collapsing in the aisles. When the police investigated the theater, they saw that one of the lifts backstage had collapsed, but there were no traces of anyone there. The only bodies recovered was that of Garis Crey. He had been found in his office. A bullet in his head. Other than that, Nothing. No blood. No struggles. Those 98 people were never seen again. After that, there's nothing left in the crate but barely visible photos of cast members and fabric samples of costumes. At this point, my investigation to the Puppetmaster's regime ended. Or at least, the historical investigation. Do you remember the revival of the Puppetmaster that I mentioned at my first entry? Well, the first preview performance will take place in Chicago on September 18th. I've already booked balcony seats. Being a full-time investigator for an obscure, pornographic musical doesn't lend itself to much of an earning, you see. And I'll be attending this showing where I'll record the audio, take notes on the production, and I'll do a detailed run-through of the production the day after I see it. Investigation will resume September 18th.